Okay, this is a gratuitous baby picture of Sadie. This is my daughter, Sadie. I think she was roughly about 1 year or so. So what we thought is we would use this time to just do a quick case study on the use of low-carb diets with a type 1 diabetic. In type 2, as Richard said, it's really, I don't want to say it's unfortunately elementary, but it's really pretty elementary. Right, Bob? And you can really make a lot of improvement and save a lot of people from grief and heartache in type 2 diabetes, which is one of the reasons why we expanded our mission from just educating and supporting type 1 diabetes to also educating and supporting type 2 diabetes as well. It's such a large societal problem. So we just thought that we would also highlight the difficulties and maybe the challenges and the successes that you can also see with type 1. So this is little Sadie when we moved to France, and our major concern was just finding an excellent place to take a photo op. So, and a little bit before she was diagnosed. So she had demonstrated increased thirst and nausea and some severe symptoms and was nearly in a coma when she was diagnosed. Just before her 3rd birthday, maybe about 2 months before her 3rd birthday. And so she was taken to the hospital there, and her HbA1c was 11.8, which I think you can kind of see from a little bit of what you learned from Dr. Feynman, that that's extremely elevated. And she was, again, I said, with that, an A1c that high, she was nearly in a coma. So just a little bit on diagnosis. When you're diagnosed, you have 3 different types of beta cells. You have some that have been destroyed, the green, some that are merely damaged, and then some that are still viable. So if you start out with the first column, you see that roughly only 20% of the beta cells have been killed off, and you start having some symptoms of the increased thirst and the nausea. And unfortunately, Sadie was probably pretty close to not having many beta cells left at all when she was diagnosed. And then, so if you're fortunate enough to catch somebody on a random check, say, because now a lot of times when you go to your pediatrician, they're doing some random blood checks, which is great. And you can catch them with a pretty good amount of pancreas function left, and maybe just a little bit that's damaged. So that with a good treatment regimen, if you keep their blood sugar relatively normal, then you can actually recover those damaged cells, and they can get nearly full pancreas function back. And that is one thing that I really wish I had known when we were diagnosed, because they told us that it's more difficult when and they call this the honeymoon period, when you have a little bit more insulin production at the beginning, and it's difficult because it's hard to match the insulin injections. The kids tend to go too low because now all of a sudden they've gotten improvements. So it's difficult to manage in children, so they tend to go up and down, which I'll show you a little bit later, and fly through all that beta cell production. So I tell you that because it's important for newly diagnosed parents to understand that it's important to guard that beta cell function, because that will help you make it through illnesses a little bit better. If you happen to take medication that raises it, it can help you make it through those tougher times. And then the other thing that's important that Tide is doing is we're doing blood sugar checks in the community, so that hopefully we're catching people and kids, adults and kids, at a little bit earlier stages, so that they can keep better pancreas function. So just a little information, because I find that this is something that people are a little bit confused about and want a little more information. So when you go to your doctor, a lot of times you'll get a fasting blood sugar. So that pretty much just tells you, you might be high before you go to bed, but your beta cells are functioning well enough to get you back down by the morning. It tells you how you're doing there. If it's still high, if it's over about 100, then actually that's the new number. It used to be that they didn't diagnose you with diabetes until you're over 120, but roughly now I think it's pretty much assumed that over 100. And then the glucose tolerance test is what everybody might know from when people are pregnant and you have to drink a bunch of sugar, and then they see what your blood sugar does at half-hour intervals after that. And the C-peptide is a way to measure, it's an indirect measurement of how much insulin you're producing. So if you have high blood sugar and a low C-peptide, you're more likely a type 1 diabetic. And if you have a higher C-peptide, generally that's more of an indication that you're more of a type 2, because you're producing a lot of insulin, but it's just not efficient and able to do its job. And then, as Dr. Feynman said, the HbA1c is a measure of the glycation of the hemoglobin, and it's used to measure how well diabetics are doing in their blood glucose control. So we went over the honeymoon period. Okay, so back to Sadie. We just moved through a couple of different methods of treating. They were slowly increasing the number of insulin shots that she was receiving. And after, it was a whirlwind at this point. She was a small child and we were just trying to keep our heads above water, so we didn't know a whole lot. And, but now going back to it, I know that the smaller the child is when they're diagnosed, the more difficult it is, because a little bit of insulin will drop them a lot and a little bit of carbohydrate will raise them a lot. So, so we were constantly swinging from lows like 33 up to over 400, swinging back down. And so, but even so, on her 2-shot regimen, her A1C went down to 7.6, and then as they moved her to 3 and to 4, we were able, the A1C really didn't change much. And one thing that was notable for us was that if we checked her at night before we went to bed, she would have to be 280 or higher not to plummet below 50 around 2 or 3 in the morning. So this was really particularly frustrating for us, because we knew if she was higher than 280 that we would get to sleep through the night, but we also knew that if she's higher than 280 that she's accruing the complications. So it was a frustrating situation. So just some more gratuitous baby Sadie pictures. And then I found this book, Pumping Insulin, and it helped us. In the beginning, they told us if the children were low to give them 15 grams of glucose, followed by a 15-gram snack. So you can see that as soon as she's low, she would, this one is when we improved it, but in general, when she would go low, then later she would shoot back up, and then we'd give her insulin and she'd plummet back down. But with this book, we were slowly learning how to not basically how to not follow the recommendations that they gave us and get a little bit of a better response. And this is a way that we learned from this book to monitor, which is now what is sort of the do-it-by-hand graph that Dr. Dykman has, a nice continuous glucose monitor to give you. Children wear them, and adults wear them, and they get readouts of their blood sugar every 5 minutes. So back in the day, we would take them way more frequently than our medical team asked us to, and they thought we were a little bit hypervigilant parents. But if you look at our graph, you can see why we were hypervigilant parents, I guess. So, but anyways, we're able to make these graphs that would enable you to see what she was doing through the day. And you can see the gray portions are pretty much normal. And the only time that Sadie was in that normal was when she was slamming down from a high or shooting up from a low. So you can imagine maybe what her behavior might have been like. You can imagine how much time she could spend learning and doing normal childhood things that you're supposed to be doing. Uh-oh. How did that happen? I swear I just clicked. And I'm not allowed to walk away.
Yeah, just stay where you are.
Stay where you are.
That's it. No? Number...
Oh, over here,
no.
over here. Yeah, there you go. Okay. I'm a little frightened of technology, so... Okay. So in the mainstream medicine, 7.5 for a small child is really pretty good. That's what they recommend. And I got patted on the back and said, you're doing a great job, Mrs. Friend. said, thanks, why do I feel like I'm going over the edge? And so this is what our life looked like. Well, you saw the graph. We were constantly reacting to highs and lows throughout the day. She would have frequent colds, intestinal parasites, nausea. You know, in addition to the daily highs and lows interrupting our lives, these other things were also then interrupting our lives. And, you know, behavioral difficulties, periods of fatigue when she should have been playing with her friends. And, you know, quick mood changes, belligerence, things like that. And not that those are totally abnormal in childhood, but I guess it's the extremeness of it and the frequency of it and the comparison to some other things, what comes later. So we were frustrated and we were trying to make our way through this, and we tried to decide, should we put her on the pump, which was the up and coming thing to do, and everybody was raving about it, or should we, I had started reading Dr. Bernstein's book, and I learned from his book that I was an early type 2 diabetic. I would not have found that information out otherwise. And so I started following his regimen for myself, and I lost about 40 pounds without exercise, because at the time I couldn't even really lift my head up to find a way to fit exercise in when I wasn't really sleeping at night, and we all know a lot of excuses we can come up with. But anyways, so this helped me to lose weight. I felt better. I could find my way to getting regular exercise. And I remained calmer during her behavioral episode. So it was really good, and we were pleased. So, but nonetheless, we were afraid to do that by ourselves, and the pump went out, and we put her on the pump, which was much more convenient. And her A1Cs improved, you know, between 7.2 and 7.6. It was more convenient. And she had more independence. You could send her to her friend's house to play. The pump was pretty easy to teach another parent how to use, and Sadie herself could pretty much dose herself pretty quickly. But the progress started leveling out. The pump sites, you have to inject it into your stomach or your leg or something like that, and they became less effective. And she got some scarring problems from them, and some of these other things continued to interrupt our lives, worsening anxiety, and the biggest one was her worsening nausea, and she was diagnosed with gastric reflux. So, you know, I was not really happy with that idea of her being on reflux medicine for the rest of her life. So I started investigating some more things, and with the help of our physician, we put her on what's called the specific carbohydrate diet at the time. It's now the GAPS protocol, if anybody's familiar with the GAPS protocol for gastrointestinal problems. It was helpful, and with that, we also lowered her, since I had had such great success with lowering my carbs, we lowered her carbs. 30 for breakfast is what they recommend, 45 grams for lunch, and 45 for dinner is what they typically recommend for a child, no matter what their age is. And we lowered her down to 12 for breakfast, 20 for lunch, and 20 for dinner. And Dr. Bernstein's recommendations are 6 and 12 and 12. But nonetheless, despite not going to his full regimen, we were able to decrease her nausea, so she wasn't coming in and out of class as often, decrease her hunger, and she was getting better numbers. Oh. Well, okay, I just gave away the secret. So, so that's what it looked like when we did that, if you remember the comparison of the other graph. So, you know, when we had spent, I mean, we have probably at least 10 to 12 of these checkbooks full of the other types that were all over the map, and then to see a day like this, you just, you can't even imagine the difference. And those are some examples of what we might have fed her on that. Some banana muffins, low-carb banana muffins that we had made, and hard-boiled eggs. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea. And why did we decide to go to him? Just to help him decide her insulin dosages, but the main reason was to decide whether her reflux was from diabetes complications or other digestive problems, and also to have medical supervision while we were putting her on a regimen that was so far out of the mainstream model. So when we went to him, her blood sugar was practically normal throughout the day by the time we came home. Her behavior was drastically improved. She wasn't, ravenously hungry all day. But the main thing was that her A1Cs were now 5.8 to 6.2. You remember when they would fuss and change little bits here and there, we were down to about 7.2. So this is a drop of 7.2 to 5.8, and it wasn't over a 3-month period of time. Well, that was the soonest we got the A1C done, but her numbers were around 100 plus or minus 20 the week that we came back. It wasn't like we were waiting for something to work. So this was huge, and her complaints of nausea were gone. So I tried to ask as unleading a question as I could, what do you notice since we've been back? And she said, I don't feel sick all the time anymore. As a parent, that's, was a horrible feeling to realize that that's how she was feeling before that, but nonetheless, it was freedom. So just quickly, I won't spend a lot of time since this is most relevant to people with that have children or relatives with type 1, but the idea is that it's a really very simple idea. Big inputs make big mistakes and smaller ones make small mistakes. That's from Dr. Bernstein. So you get error from carbohydrate estimation. The packaging is allowed up to 20% error straight up, and when a lot of people will guesstimate rather than measuring, and so you're looking at about 40% error. The insulin is not absorbed reliably. Some of it is damaged by the immune system as it's injected, and the larger the dose, the more error that you get from your insulin injection. And then there's also what Dr. Feynman alluded to in terms of the insulin timing is difficult to match. We can't match it like in the insulin that you make can match it. So, so that's a quick idea of why you get, I won't drag through this too much, but you can see if you have a large number of carbohydrates, the 45 grams that they were recommending, and you work through, Dr. Bernstein is a genius in that he can tell you exactly how much 1 gram of carbohydrate would raise her and how much 1 unit of Humalog would lower her, much more accurately than we had ever received before. And then you can see that down at the bottom line, if she went into the meal at 100, her error could be anywhere above that by 225 points or anywhere below that by 225 points. So if it all stacked up in one direction, she would be way high, and the other direction, and she would be dangerously low to where you couldn't get her to drink enough glucose to keep it up. So, and as a parent, that's one of the most frightening things that you'll experience. And then when you go down to Dr. Bernstein level and you reduce her to 12 grams of carbohydrates, you can see that if you go into the meal at 100, you're looking at only 32 points roughly of error above and below, or anywhere in between. And so that 68 low is much more doable and much more manageable, and you can, in 2 o'clock in the morning, give her 2 small Smarties and go to bed knowing that you're pretty good till the next morning. So I can't underestimate the benefit of sleep. There are some cons. It's difficult to do in a world where everybody can eat whatever they want, whenever they want, and food is really more about what's quick and easy than and what tastes really good, rather than what's best for our health. And it's also one of the reasons for us doing this program today is because it's very difficult to find healthcare providers that understand it, let alone tolerate it, or tell you that you're not harming yourself. I think we had a discussion about that today. So, but how can you stick to it or not stick to it? So let's look, for myself, I've been doing a low carbohydrate diet now for, Sadie was 5 when I started, so 16 years or so, and I tolerate it much better because I feel much better, and that's the difference. The diet that they ask us to stick to, it doesn't make any difference to me, so it's harder to stick to it. But my diet makes me feel so much better that it is easier for me to stay on. And so Sadie had some difficulties going through middle school. Well, her A1Cs were that 5.8 to 6.2 while we had total control over her, what she ate. And here are some struggles that she went through in middle school. But even so, she probably ate what people would call in moderation. And her A1Cs were able to stay in that 6 to 6'5" range, which what in moderation means was whenever she was away from me, she would eat something she wasn't supposed to have. And so some of the problems started to return, varying blood glucose and frequent absences from school from being ill, or difficulty recovering from illnesses. And in high school, of course, they get more freedom and the more time away, and they want to be more and more normal like other children. So, so her A1Cs went back up, heartbreakingly so, to from 7 to 8.5. That is not too far off the scale from children in high school who are rebelling. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. But you can see that she started having a multitude of problems that were returning. So these are the targets that they have set that they want you to be under. Now they're starting to move these down to the 7.5 level for all children. So that only means that less people will be achieving them. So you can see that it's already pretty low. 23% achieve what they recommend, 20%, you get the idea. So here's how Sadie compared with that. So here you can see she was doing pretty good compared to the norm when she was young. And then we found Dr. Bernstein, and she's off the chart down here and stayed there for a good while. She started going up in middle school, up in high school. I was getting a little frustrated, and I told her that she couldn't get her learner's permit until she got it down to 7. Whoop! It went down to 7. And I told her that she couldn't get her driver's license until it was 6.5. What happened there? So you can see that she was able to do it because she had the tools to be able to do it, and the error, you can't do this with a kid that's on the standard regimen because really the error is out of their control. And you saw the amount of error that it was. So, we had slippery slopes, and then she went back up here. I'll just add a few recent ones. She went to college, which is typically, let me just say that a lot of times you get in high school with kids with diabetes, you get really extreme rebellion, and you end up with A1Cs into the 10, 11, 12, and 13%, which is when they're really causing damage and can get peripheral neuropathy very quickly and other very damaging complications that we think of for people when they're older. But these kids can get them because they're not taking their insulin and they're not doing that. So, though this made me incredibly sad, I still have to hold the big picture in mind. And this was when she was back off to college. So she went off to college, and she now will have times when sets her mind to it, and she will start exercising, and she will start eating better on her low carb diet, and she's able to bring her A1Cs down to 6 and 6.5, and she's off living on her own and taking care of everything, even ordering all of her own diabetes supplies, which I don't think anybody can really appreciate how important that is. But anyways, these are some of my final thoughts, and one of the biggest ones I will tell you is that just because something is difficult doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And it doesn't mean that it's not worth doing to show your children that something difficult can be done and that they can do it. So I think I will stop there and say that one of our main missions is that we would like for low carbohydrate diets to become a treatment option, and for physicians and medical staff to realize that they're safe and efficient and a very good way to manage diabetes.